There we go. Well, good morning, Emily Campbell. It's so lovely to have you here from the Center for Community Solutions, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to interview you. If it's all right with you, I'll just start with some questions, and we'll start with the first question, which is just tell me a little bit about yourself and your role at Center for Community Solutions.
Sure. So I am the president and CEO at the Center for Community Solutions, a position that I've held since December. So just approaching my 6 month mark in this particular role, but I've been with the organization for about 17 years. And the Center for Community Solutions is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy and research think tank. So we were founded in 1913, have been around for well over a century, headquartered in Cleveland, and also have an office in Columbus. And our mission is to improve health, social, and economic conditions, which we do through public policy advocacy, through applied demographic research, through strategic communications. And so we have the opportunity to work from the deepest grassroots to the highest echelons of power and everything in between, really thinking about how we can influence systemic change through public policy change. That's really what we're trying to do. But in terms of my background, I have degrees in international studies and economics from Case Western. I also have a master's in political science from Case Western as well. Spent several years working for a US congressman in Pennsylvania before coming back to Cleveland, or to Cleveland permanently, um, and started at Community Solutions as a policy assistant. Shifted over to lead our applied research work for about 10 years, where I had the opportunity to do lots of collaborating and consulting with a whole bunch of groups trying to do great things in communities. Um, and then spent about a year and a half as chief operating officer before stepping into the CEO role following the retirement of our former executive director.
That's great. Are you a Cleveland native by any chance?
No, I grew up in the Pittsburgh area.
Okay, all right, but not far away. Not far.
No,
Not
similar experience. Although, Cleveland thinks of itself as Midwest and Pittsburgh does not think that it is a Midwest city, but certainly has an awful lot in common.
Yeah, it's funny that dividing line. I'm not. I'm also not. I'm not from Ohio or
Mm,
from Pennsylvania. I'm from the South, but I've noticed that dividing line seems to fall right between Ohio and Pennsylvania. It's interesting.
yeah, definitely shifts more toward Philadelphia and the Eastern Seaboard, and sort of how Pittsburghers think of themselves positioned in the country.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's true. Um, I was also really interested in some of the previous work that you did at Center for Community Solutions. You were in that position you just described a minute ago. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the title of the that you were in for 10 years, where
Yeah,
you're
the director of applied research.
director
Mhm.
of applied research. So can you tell me a little bit about what that job was like?
Sure. So that position leads Community Solutions Applied Research Team. You know, we have some endowment and trust income that supports our applied research work, and the emphasis is on applied, on the applied piece of it. So at Community Solutions, although we are a think tank, we're not doing research that you would ever expect to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. It's very practical,
Mhm.
practical and tactical, compiling information. And so the work that we do in terms of research is an awful lot of light lit review of pulling in data from a bunch of different sources to illuminate something important about community, to either identify where needs are, see where there might be gaps, think about what are the problems that are facing people in Cleveland and in Ohio, and what might be some of the solutions to those things. So, for example, we do an awful lot of work with statistics from the American Community Survey of the US Census Bureau. It's
Mhm.
public data, anyone can access it,
Mhm.
but many of the groups that we're working with don't have the time, expertise, or inclination to go on the census website, pull it down, and kind of understand what they're looking at and what the implications of that may be. So we do lots of analysis and interpretation. as well as trying to understand and explain what population level statistics or data might mean for foundations and philanthropy, for government, for nonprofit organizations and service providers and others who need information to be able to make decisions about where to allocate their resources, whether those are dollars or energy, or think about how to have the most impact in their work. So that's really what our applied research work is about. The other aspect of it is that we really try to accelerate conversations about community issues. So we most like um, doing research and pulling together information that can help drive some conversation about community issues. So I think a great example, several years ago, we took on a priority of infant and maternal health. It was originally infant health, then we expanded to maternal health when a lot of the infant mortality initiatives really started to be generated, moved into looking at maternal health because it was an aspect that we felt like was being ignored in the conversation about how to help more babies reach their first birthdays.
Right.
And now we're thinking about, all right, what's the next thing? Now that in some ways the work has been successful, there is a lot more attention and understanding about the importance of maternal health. Do we think about maternal mental health or mental health in general? Do we look at issues of systemic racism? Do we think about things across the lifespan or other family issues? So really trying to be a bit ahead of the curve, but driving conversation and progress in the direction of improvement. And what might be missing that we want to try and insert into the overall conversation.
Yeah. Did you work with the Beautiful Birthing Center? Is that one of the, yeah.
Yeah, with birthing beautiful communities, yes, we've worked with them in a little bit of an informal way. Our staff are also engaged with First Year Cleveland, in which is the infant mortality initiative, in a little bit more of a systemic way, and then also working in other communities outside of Cuyahoga County and Cleveland and Ohio to illuminate their issues and data and to take a look at things. Stark County has been incredibly successful at reducing not only infant mortality, but also the disparity between Black and white babies and infant mortality.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah. Well, this is a whole nother follow-up conversation.
Right?
Jasmine Long was our or it just finished, I think, her advocacy in residence at Kent
Ah,
State. Yes.
wonderful.
So
Yes.
we had a chance, and my colleague and friend, who's Carla Gore, who's the director of the Anti-Racism and Equity Institute at Kent State, was instrumental in bringing her there. So there's a lot of effort going on at Kent State as well. So
Great.
yeah, no, there's lots of overlap between interests here. So thank you. That's really helpful. I'm going to ask you now. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I
Well,
interrupt?
yeah, what I the reason that I like to bring up the infant mortality example
Yeah,
too is that I think it's a great example of how communities, when they're willing to look into the data and information and ask questions about, to kind of go beyond just the one statistic, to
right.
see who's being impacted and what can they do about it, how quickly we can see population level change. I just think it's a good example of what we at Community Solutions are trying to do in a lot of different areas and how it can work and be successful.
Right. And I was really impressed with your talk that you gave in February at the City Club
Mm,
about some of the changes and linking it to other things. It's like you pull the thread on a sweater and everything unravels and you start to see things and how they're interrelated. That was
absolutely.
really impressive. So great. So now I'm going to ask you some specific
Sure.
questions about how do you think your organization sees its role in citizen engagement? You've talked a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah, good question. This is an issue that Community Solutions often struggles with and talks about a lot because we really don't see our audience as individual citizens. The people that we're working with and talking to are either grass tops level often, or other organizations, professionals in the field, some of those things. But where it it happens that we do engage citizens and community members, it's all the better because there's always um, so much rich learning. You know, we all come with our own assumptions about how things work on the ground or in people, how people things play out in people's lives, but really hearing from people is very important. So there's a couple of ways that we engage in citizen engagement. One is that as we're doing research and consulting work, we often say that you have to go back to the source and just ask people. We shouldn't make assumptions about what may be holding people back or what challenges people are facing. And so we do an awful lot of focus groups and of surveys and of key informant interviews. You know, not being a university, we don't have to go through IRB. So these are
Right.
more conversation than sort of very technical research to try and again learn something about what's happening, and to be guided and directed. And then we are also embarking on some work and really recommitting to some work that we've done in the past to try and build policy advocacy capacity within the greater Cleveland community. And so one of the things we are doing is working very intentionally in the Buckeye neighborhood of Cleveland to identify cohort of policy ambassadors. These are residents of the neighborhood, intergenerational, a group of a handful of older adults, a group of a handful of young adults to work in collaboration, but to be able to help try and connect some of the work that we do at Community Solutions with people who are impacted by the issues relating to poverty and public benefits that we work on, and also learn from them as well, hear what's important to them, and bring that back to the policymakers to hopefully influence some really good policy objectives. So, you know, our work is rather technical, it is complex, it is nuanced. The folks on our team read legislation and understand Medicaid regulations better
Mhm.
than most.
Mhm.
Better than most. And so that's a lot of the world that we operate in, but are always trying to take that a step further to think about how things really play out in the real world.
Yeah, that's that's fascinating. And when we're done, we can follow up on. I have some
Okay.
follow-up questions for you on that. Also, how do you see your organization, or do you see your organization involved in issues of smart infrastructure?
Ooh, can you tell me what you mean by smart infrastructure?
For example, Cleveland has stoplights or traffic lights that are set to be smart depending on the traffic patterns, and they can all relate and to help with the flow of traffic. So there's sensors involved in that. You know, if you think about smart city stuff, you think about, oh, increased ability, like bus stops. You've seen in some cities where they have the
Yeah,
digital GPS, and you can see, oh, this bus will be here in 3 minutes, you know. So any kind of smart
yeah,
infrastructure.
not really.
Yeah,
No,
no,
no, that's
that's
an
not
area where
Cleveland.
we don't particularly work. But if we did, it would be about what's the information that people really need. And you know, some of those the questions we ask is like, what's a nice to have, what's a must have
Right.
situation.
That's really a great question. What is needed and what can you
Yeah.
do without? Yeah. How about economic development?
Oh, economic development. So, the Center for Community Solutions focuses a lot of our work on the causes and consequences of poverty and the things that influence that. So, when we think about economic development, or when I think about economic development, I'm thinking about the conditions that are facing people in neighborhoods, um, very much, and especially the lower income or people with barriers to employment or those that have been left behind in some of the knowledge economy is really where we think about economic development. And you had referenced my City Club presentation in February, and it was striking when we looked at some of the data for Cleveland that since the 1960s, Cleveland has lost half of its population, you know, gone from over 800,000 people to about 360,000 people,
Yeah.
since you know the war on poverty came into being over the
Yeah.
course of decades. It looks like it's slowed. I think we probably slowed down or maybe even stopped shrinking. But over the same period of time, the number of people who are living in poverty has remained relatively steady. I mean, it's
Right.
a straight line. If you graph it, it's a straight line. So then it's not a surprise that Cleveland's poverty rate has doubled over the course of those decades.
Sure.
And so that's the kind of information that we try to talk about in economic development, and to think about, this isn't poverty is not a problem that Cleveland will be able to grow itself out of in terms of growing the population. Because we're not talking about 1,000 people or even a couple thousand people. It's hundreds of thousands of people
Right.
who have moved out of Cleveland, and they're not all coming back. And if they did, we would probably have a lot of infrastructure problems to
Right.
have to contend with. And so, what we challenge leaders to do is to think about what are the conditions that we're really facing and who do we have here in our community and how do we build economic development that works for the people that are here, less about economic development in attracting Intel or Amazon or sort of looking for solutions outside. Are there things that we can do within neighborhoods and communities to solve a couple of problems at once? I was just having a conversation yesterday or the day before, um, with some people talking about how one of the really challenging issues facing Clevelanders right now is childcare, is a lack of childcare that works for their families or works for their jobs, and it's expensive and it's hard to find and high quality, and sort of the list goes on and on. It's something that got a lot worse in the pandemic and has not gotten any better. At the same time, we have challenges in some of Cleveland's neighborhoods, with high unemployment of people who are over the age of 50. And
Mm-hmm.
so, are there ways to connect the workforce needs in the childcare system with the people who are already living in these neighborhoods?
Right.
Um, because when I'm in meetings talking about the childcare workforce crisis, the place that people often go first is the new workforce. People who are in school, people who are going to the community colleges, who may be going to Kent State, the sort of
Mhm.
next
Right.
generation of workers. But we might have a quicker solution that can solve a couple of problems at once. And can you imagine living in a neighborhood where your neighbors are those who are working to watch your children and building those interpersonal relationships? So we're thinking about economic development really in a sense of well-being
Right.
for people, but trying to be very realistic about the challenges that we're facing and how long it's going to take and what it's going to take in order to see thriving people and thriving community.
Right. Right. That's just a great, that's a, it's a, to me, it's like a no-brainer. Looking at, you've got the aging population who, by the way, often are lonely.
Yes.
They need that interaction. And I can tell you from the personal experience at this age, I don't have any grandchildren. I
Mhm.
have two daughters, but I don't have any grandchildren yet. They're like a lot of young career women, or they're not so young now. They're passing the age of childbearing, but they're thinking about doing it late, right?
Yeah.
I may not be a grandmother till I'm 70 something,
Right.
I mean, it could be a long time. And I love children, and having time
Right.
to be with a child long enough to enjoy them and then give them back because I get tired. you know,
Right. Right.
it makes so much sense. And my undergraduate degree, I took a lot of child development classes, and there's a lot of good reasons to do this. In addition to all those things you said, not
Right.
only does it economically make sense, it's also building that community
Hmm.
neighborhood that thrives. You use the word thrive, and it thrives so much better
Right.
when you get that sense of community that seems, and it's not just Cleveland, it seems to be lacking in
Right.
so many cities throughout the country. So I'm really excited about that. I'll be watching that
Yeah,
for sure.
we'll see. We'll
Yeah,
see. And even when you think about, we hear a lot about mismatch between job where people work and where people live, or where the jobs are and where people live. Well, childcare is a place-based profession, right?
right,
And so, what we try to do is ask some of those questions, make some suggestions, sort of say, well, have you thought about this, and see what what might generate from that, from some
Right.
of that.
And it seems to me that I remember seeing some statistics. I don't know if it was from Center for Community Solutions, probably because that's where I get most of my Cleveland data.
Thank you.
But their transportation issues are also a problem.
Yes.
So again, how are you going to get your children to someone
Right.
for
Yes.
childcare? So is that something that you see in these particular households that need childcare that don't
Yeah.
have transportation?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, okay. Well,
So,
that's good to know. That's great work. And how about this is a different one. It's kind
okay.
of different for you, but I could see how you could be involved in this. How about fair and equitable online access?
Oh, that's an interesting one. So that's an issue that we sort of dabble around the
Mhm,
edges of.
mhm,
So we do compile statistics and information about digital access as it has become very important. We watched with great interest what happened with the digital divide during the pandemic, especially the efforts of K-12 education to just, I mean, connected so many families so much more quickly. And last year, Community Solutions partnered with the Cleveland Foundation on some work that the Cleveland Foundation was doing as part of a statewide effort to look at digital equity and inclusion.
mhm,
And so it's an example of where, we were brought in by another entity because of our expertise in connecting with community and being able to go out and ask people questions and the sort of trust that was already built there to tell us how it really is.
right?
Um, and so traveled around throughout the region doing some listening sessions to hear about people's challenges with the digital divide and digital equity and think about what investments can the state make. And it was interesting because we're like less interested in the infrastructure piece of it
Yeah.
and more about the barriers in
Uh-huh.
terms of whether it's devices, people have connectivity, they don't have devices, or they have devices, but they don't know how to use them. So now your device has become a very expensive paperweight, or, um, someone has been the victim or almost the victim, a close call of a scam, and they're skittish to use the tools that might be available to them. So we get involved in those aspects. And then the other piece where we really think about digital equity is in the emergence of telehealth and telemedicine. And, this is a place where, oh my gosh, we saw so much progress during the pandemic, and especially in, for example, Medicaid covering telehealth visits. They hadn't done
Yeah.
that before. It was
Yeah.
extremely limited. The door was thrown wide open out of necessity
Right.
and hasn't been closed again. Maybe a
Right.
little bit closed, but and it's an area where we've seen incredible progress
Right.
in behavioral health and mental health treatment
Right.
and reducing some of the barriers to access of having to be there. And so we do some work to think about and advocate for keeping the best of what we learned during the pandemic to not turn the clock back on some of those things. Now it doesn't work for everyone. It's not the answer in every case. In person is still very important, but the more that we can provide a number of different tools for people to get the help they need, the better it is for everyone. And so, all of these issues are things where we don't focus primarily on them necessarily, but they come in because everything is layered on top
That's
when
right.
we're talking about people's lives and families and community. You
Right.
can't separate out any of these
That's right.
issues.
Education, health, finance,
Yeah.
all of those things. We call them life sectors in our
Okay.
project. Yeah. So yeah, we understand that complicated sweater.
Yes. Yes.
Oh yeah, that's a lot. But that's amazing that you're doing so many different things.
Hmm.
Even though maybe it's not necessarily your immediate plan, it comes in that there are these barriers that pop up and these new challenges, and you've got to figure out ways to do them, is what it sounds like. You've got to
Yeah.
address them anyway. So
Right.
yeah.
Right.
Um, what would you say in terms of information is hard for your organization to find?
Oh, yeah. It's an interesting question for me and for my organization because we trade in information. I mean, that's the
That's
that's
right,
the
we do.
basis of what
Yep,
we're doing. And so often we're the place where people turn when they're looking for information that they can't find.
that's right.
Right. So what, yeah, you know, a place where we've seen enormous progress and information being available is in health data.
Yep,
So it wasn't that long ago that the only good, reliable health statistics we had were at a county level. And in a place like Cleveland and Cuyahoga County and across the state, um, the county level stats only tell you part of the story and
right.
obscure so much variety within and among communities. And it meant it was very difficult to target resources, energy, efforts, and attention. And sort of we were relying on people's impressions, which, that's okay. Um, Ned Hill from Cleveland State University, he used to often say that the plural of anecdote is data. And I think that's part of what we saw in some of this. But the CDC has made much more health data available at smaller geographies that let us take a look at some of the differences between places in smaller
Oh,
geographies. So that's one element where the information is really hard to find. The other piece that we have a challenge with is timeliness of data.
yeah,
You know, things have changed a lot. I keep talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, but it really was this moment in time where usually 5-year-old data was fine. Stuff doesn't change that much on a population level. All of a sudden, if it's before 2020, it's irrelevant.
right,
Unless we're seeing being able to demonstrate change
right,
over
right.
time. And so that presents some real challenges. If we go back to the maternal mortality and morbidity, the state just released a report, and I think they're relying on 2018 data.
Yeah,
And it's like, the women who gave birth in 2018, their children are 5 years old now, moving
right.
into a different phase of life. We shouldn't be designing things based on information that's that old. So those are some of the things that we find really difficult, but we are sponges. So we absorb lots of information from lots of places and then try to put it all together to get a
Mhm.
sort of full picture of what's happening that then we can share and answer some questions and have some insights.
Right. Are there any particular, uh, I mean, do you fill the gap? Do you do much in terms of filling the gaps by doing your own research then?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this because one of the things that we're really excited about is that we are doing some work to put together updated data profiles, fact sheets for Cleveland's neighborhoods.
Hmm.
They'll be out in the next couple of months. We've done this before, relying mostly on census data, and in order to do it, we had to break apart block groups and build them back together again.
Uh-huh.
Essentially, but census data only takes you so far. So thanks to the Cleveland Foundation and some funding from them, we're building our capacity to bring in different data sources to do estimates for locally meaningful geographies that don't show up in any data source. So neighborhoods are really important to
Uh,
people living in Cleveland, to those who are operating in Cleveland, trying to address issues, but neighborhood doesn't show up on any, data source. And so we're trying to do that. We did the same thing with the Ohio State Senate and House of Representatives legislative district because the lines got redrawn. Census data hasn't caught up, but to really give legislators a sense of who they're representing,
right.
they're going to be redrawn again. So we knew we were going to have to do it again a year later, but it's the same thing, breaking apart the geographies that we have and then putting them back together so that we have real estimates that line up with the boundaries of a geography that matters. So we do that sort of slicing and dicing of information, and a whole that's in the applied research side. We also do a lot of information sharing, research collection, compiling things on the policy side of things too, which is uh, a little less tangible.
Yeah,
um, but
yeah,
sharing information about what are in proposals, what would it actually do? Let's interpret some of the policy language into sort of real world. What does this mean? Is this really a change? Is it not a change? Um, we do a lot of that work too, to just try and help those who are making decisions have information they can rely on.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Is there a burning question that keeps you up nights that you can't seem to get the answer for?
Mm. Burning. I mean, there's so many questions. Every answer brings more questions.
Yep.
You know, the it can be summed up in one word, I guess, which is why. That's always the question is why. So the information that we have and the data that we have tells us what, but it almost never tells us why. And so we're starting to understand some of the mechanisms and the whys. And I'm thinking here of the data and the research on adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress and weathering for people of color. And there's research that's showing the biological mechanisms
Mm-hmm.
that connect some of those social experiences to physical health outcomes, to show that there are that really happens. And some of the emerging research about um, how disadvantage can be passed down through generations in genetic ways that
Uh,
we always knew. We observed it. We knew that this was happening, but we didn't really understand why, or didn't have a way to understand that these are biological and physical attributes. It's not about people's choices, and that generational poverty is more than about just the jobs that you take or the decisions you make. There are aspects of it that have that sort of physiological piece of it. So it's understanding those mechanisms, um, for why, because on the surface, and we hear some frustration from policymakers and community leaders, in a lot of ways, we do all the right things. Cleveland invests billions of dollars in health and social services. We're still the second poorest large city in the
right,
country.
right,
Why are we not seeing the progress that we would
right,
hope to see or expect to see? What's still holding us back? And I think the
right.
more that we can, that's really, I think, the question that keeps me up at night, or that I'm constantly thinking about, is what are we missing here? Because you put in input A and we're not getting, output B. Something's happening in between. Um, but every day we're learning more. We're asking the questions, we're recognizing um, that all these issues are combined, that poor kids live in poor families, that some of these avenues, um, to try some different solutions to address issues.
As a criminal court judge once told me, he was getting ready to retire. This is in Tennessee. And he said, the question to him was, you know, if you could change one thing, what would you change? And he said, when I started my career, I saw the same, 2% of the families committing 98% of the crime. And he said, 20 years later, I saw the same 2% of the same families committing these crimes. And now he's seeing the grandchildren. And he said that for him, the one thing he would change would be to add early childhood education as a
Mm,
mandatory,
mhm,
have early childhood
mhm,
experiences through school of some sort. Yeah. Yeah.
mhm.
So, and that's been 30 years ago that he
Yeah.
said that. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a good question. Why aren't we seeing more progress? We have knowledge. We know these things. Why are we not why are we not putting the sweater together, which is why I wanted to talk to you, because you are putting the sweater together.
Well, we're trying.
And you
Yeah.
and you're making progress.
Yeah, and part of my research, and my policy work focuses on benefits cliffs, which are parts of public benefit programs where if someone earns just a dollar too much, they lose a public benefit worth
Right.
hundreds of dollars to their
Yes.
families. And so, what we often ask people who are on the journey from poverty to economic security to do is to make good decisions, or to budget our way out of poverty.
Yeah.
Well, you can't do that. The system's stacked against
That's
people.
right. That's
And there
right.
are definitely times and instances where the good economic decision is not to take a raise, not to
That's
get a
right.
promotion, not to work more hours.
Not to get
So,
out of poverty.
We share that, and we share that, and we share the places where that happens. It happens a lot. And childcare is a big one. Medicaid is another one. And to say how can we change policy in ways that eliminates these disincentives to work, and so for me it's a lot about asking what are the frustrations and then figuring out what might be causing them. Frustrations both for policymakers and leaders, but also for people in their lives, because maybe there are things that we can cobble together to eliminate some of those frustrations.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. It's the same. I mean, I did some work in domestic violence, for
Yeah,
example. I mean, I was just watching something on TV and they were saying, well, oh, it was some old Law and Order episode. And, they're going, why didn't she just leave?
right,
And it's like, what people don't know is that they don't leave because they're safer by staying. Many times there they get beat up, but if they try to leave, they'll get killed and their
right,
children will get killed.
right,
And we blame the women. Historically, we've blamed the women for this. And it's not because women are brainwashed, it's because they don't have an out to get out of this.
yeah.
So, yeah, and I interviewed women in domestic violence shelters once, and I said, tell me your favorite fairy tale. And I
Hmm.
had a woman who said, Peter Pan, that's what it was, Peter Pan. And I said, oh, that's very interesting. Why Peter Pan? And she said, because Peter could fly away.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it was really
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
I see a lot of hope and a lot of progress in the 17 years that I've been at Community Solutions, with more and more people willing to recognize that if it were easy we would have already done it, and to
Right.
sort of ask those questions about, like, wait, why don't women leave those situations? Oh, there's more going on here than maybe we
And you knew.
thought.
That's
A-
right.
and and just acknowledging that means that we can start to build programs and solutions that can help overcome some of those things. It may be a simple economic situation where they can't afford to hire movers to move their stuff out, and so are
Right.
stuck.
Right.
And sometimes it's a much larger question, but
Sure.
every time you sort of ask what's going on here, you almost always reveal something that might be simple to get us a little bit
A
closer
little
or
bit
part of
better.
the way there.
That's right. That's
Or
right.
for some people, there's an easy answer.
Right. One final question for you. When you hear the term smart city, what does that
Ah,
mean to you?
smart city. Yeah, I think smart cities are ones that do take a clear-eyed look at the issues that are facing the cities and the people who live in them. I think when people hear smart, they think about technology, and that's one aspect and area of things. But going back to what we talked about a little bit at the beginning, you know, the technology should be a means to an end, and the goals of thriving communities have not changed over centuries. It's all the same goals.
Right.
Um, for what thriving means, there may be a little bit different flavor to it. And so when I think of a smart city, what I love to see is the use of technology applied to some of those critical community problems. So thinking about some of those mismatches, um, some of the examples I love are, one great example is that several years ago we had a lot of conversations about chronic absenteeism, children missing school. Children would miss a lot of school at the end of the year. Turned out that the public housing leases for apartments didn't line up with the school year, and so families would have to move before the school year is over. Just by lining up those leases,
Right.
you can have an impact on a problem that has nothing to do with housing.
Right.
Um, and so, are there ways? Smart cities, I believe, are ones that utilize technology and information and new tools in ways to address old problems or persistent problems.
That's perfect. That's a perfect definition. I may have to quote you on that.
Great.
That's exactly right. I love that explanation and that definition. That's wonderful. Is there anything else you want to share with me? Any final parting thoughts?
Else, I think the final parting thought is that all of this takes a lot of time. And one of the things that I see that holds communities back sometimes is impatience. And especially when we're thinking about policy change, it really is a situation where we are asking legislators and elected officials to plant the seeds of a tree they're never going to see. And
Right.
that the progress that gets made is going to be someone else's to take credit for it. It's not going to happen. That's a hard thing to ask people, but
Yeah.
especially when they need to go to voters every few years and ask to be reappointed to their jobs.
Right.
It's very challenging. And so one of the things I like to say is that we can do anything, but we can't do everything.
Right.
And so figuring out where do we apply our energy, our attention, our resources to have the most impact is very challenging. Because if these things were inexpensive or fast or easy, we would have already done them. But thinking about the choices that propel communities forward and what are the things we can do today, recognizing that we may not see the benefit of them in the future.
Right. Right. That's right. Wonderful. Great thoughts to leave with. And I greatly thank you for carving out so much time to talk with me about this and to share your views and to tell us more about the Center for Community Solutions and the wonderful work that you're doing there. So
Sure,
thank
happy to.
you.
Anytime.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you. Hold on.